Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to the fourth episode of Intimate Judaism. I'm Talli Rosenbaum.
And I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn, and I want to thank all of our listeners who've given us such wonderful feedback about our first 3 episodes plus our pilot. If you haven't listened to them yet, please go to intimatejudaism.com. That's intimatejudaism.com. And we're happy to hear from you. Please write to us at intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. Again, that's intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com, and tell us what you want to hear about. And today, Talli, we have an episode that people have said they want to hear about.
A few people have written in and have asked us to talk a little bit about Shomer Negiah, which, for those of you who are not familiar with the term, is a term that's used to describe the expectation that single individuals do not touch one another before marriage, and what happens when individuals, couples, do touch before marriage, how to negotiate that, how to talk about it.
So we're going to be talking in particular about adolescents and people in their 20s, people who have not yet been married. I think that's the focus in particular, but we're going to talk about halachically obviously applies to anybody who's unmarried. Before we start speaking about some of the educational and other pedagogic issues, I thought I'd go through the halachic issues as well, just to first mention what the baseline of what we're talking about really is and where it comes from.
One thing that's very important to point out is that any sort of sex education program needs to take into consideration what are your values and attitudes about sexuality. And so we are talking about sex education within the context of what our values are. Our values are informed by our texts, so take it away and teach us the text.
So before talking about Shomer Negiah per se, I want to first mention the idea of premarital sex. And is that a Torah prohibition or is it a Rabbinic prohibition? And in fact, it's a machloket, an argument, like so many things are. The Rambam, and he mentions this in several places, in Sefer Mitzvot, Lo Ta'aseh, Shin Nun Hey, 355. He also mentions it in Hilchot Isrei Bia, Yud Chet Halacha Bet, and in Hilchot Ishut, Perek Aleph Halacha Dalid. All of these sources will be on the show notes, so you can look there for more details. He says that premarital sex between two Jews is a Torah prohibition.
Yes.
And that's apart from any issues of nida. Now, along with that, I should point out the Ravid, who writes his notes on the Rambam on the spot, he says that's not true. He said this is not a Torah prohibition. And similarly, the Ramban says the only Torah prohibition of premarital sex is between two people who halachically can't get married. I don't mean that it's asur to get married. It's not that it's prohibited to get married, but that should they try to get married, it wouldn't work.
Because? There's
a concept called Kedushin Tofsim Bo or not. Does the Kedushin actually work? So for example, if a Kohen marries somebody like a divorcee, he's not allowed to do so, but the Kedushin works. And the Ramban would say that is not included in the prohibition of premarital sex. However, if a brother wants to marry a sister, the Kedushin doesn't even work. So in a case like that, that's an example where the Ramban would say that's the prohibition in the Torah of premarital sex between two people for whom the Kedushin are not tofsin. They don't actually work. So that's premarital sex.
And that would be a rayot. Well, that would be in all cases that people can't be together. If they're related.
Yes, but on the other hand, you're saying something which is true but overly broad because, and this is an important point actually for what we're going to be talking about, nida is considered erva in the Rambam, and yet he says that is an example where Kedushin does work. In other words, if somebody marries someone who is a nida, even though technically it isn't erva, it's part of arayot, nevertheless, Kedushin are tofsin. So broadly speaking, you're right, though there are some details which are a little more complicated than that. So beyond that, in terms of defining sex, we don't have to get into that now. Let's just say any sort of situation where there is either vaginal or anal penetration. That is what is called
sex. The definition of sex,
according
to the Rambam.
Exactly. The definition of sex according to the Rambam, Hilchot Isrei Bia, Perek Aleph Halacha Yud. Again, look in the show notes to see all the details about that. There are other details which we're not going to get into now about it. It's not as simple as I just said, but that's the basic definition for what we're dealing with. So now let's get into touching, what we talk about in terms of Shomer Negiah. And once again, is it a Torah law or is it a rabbinic law? So in that situation, we have the Rambam in Hilchot Isrei Bia, Perek Kaf Aleph Halacha Aleph. He also says it in Sefer Mitzvot, Lo Ta'aseh, Shin Nun Gimel, where he says that it actually is a Torah prohibition based on the pasuk in Vayikra, Perek Yudchet, pasuk Vav, and pasuk Yudtet, where it says, Lo tikruvu legalot erva. You should not get even close to uncovering her nakedness, which means, according to the Rambam, one may not touch anyone who is an erva, someone who is a sorcier. Okay, and the erva now is broadly defined the way you said before, though, even including a nida. And in fact, the pasuk specifically refers to a nida. The Ramban, in contrast, says it's only rabbinic prohibition, and he explains this pasuk in various ways. He says ultimately that it's a type of asmachta. He says this in his notes to Sefer Mitzvot. And asmachta, there are different interpretations of what this means. It essentially means some way where it's in the Torah, not as a Torah law, but almost a way of remembering it. It's not really a Torah law, according to most opinions. The Ritva disagrees, but according to most opinions, it's a way of remembering what Chazal said rabbinically. They attach it to a pasuk, even though it's not really in the Torah per se. So the Ramban says it's not a Torah law. The Rambam does. The Rambam, in describing this, he's talking about chibuk v'nishuk. He says explicitly, we're talking about sexual touching, petting,
making out.
We're not talking about handshakes and the like. That's a different discussion for a different time. We're not dealing with that right now because I don't think anyone's interested in whether your child is allowed to give a handshake to somebody. That's not our topic for today. We're talking about making out. And
although for kids who go around saying I'm Shomer, that's what they do. They say I can't high five you. I'm Shomer.
That's true. So on a social level, there's a lot to be discussed in terms of what we mean when we say I'm Shomer, what kids mean when they say they're Shomer, and why they why they say it or like to show that they're not. But for our purposes over here, really making out is really, I think, the thing that most parents are probably more concerned about or interested in finding out in terms of how to direct their children when it comes to these things. Interestingly, I'll just point out one side point. When the Rambam talks about hugging and kissing, he also mentions what's called derech evarim, which includes oral sex and the like, in the same context. It's the same prohibition, he says, in that same spot, from that same pasuk. Talli, before I'll give the floor to you, I'm actually very hesitant in some ways to discuss this at all, because when I talk about, is it a Torah prohibition, is it a rabbinic prohibition, on some level, I'm afraid that I'm sort of giving the impression that if it's not a Torah prohibition, then maybe it's not so bad and maybe it's okay for people to do that. So let me say right now that when I say something is a Torah prohibition or it's a rabbinic prohibition, my intent is not to say that do the lesser of two evils. That's not what I'm saying. It's not that I'm giving a heter. I'm not saying if it's not a Torah prohibition, it's okay. As halachic Jews, we say rabbinic prohibitions are also asur. You can't do them. So I'm almost torn on some level because on the one hand,
I hear you.
On one hand, we want to tell people the halachic reality. We don't want them to misinterpret it and say, well, he said this is only a rabbinic prohibition, so therefore I can do that. That's not what we're saying. But then there's the other side, which is if we just say, don't care whether it's Torah or rabbinic, you can't do any of it, and then someone's doing it anyway, maybe there's something to be said for somebody who's interested in keeping within the halachic system as much as possible within whatever touching they're doing. And at the same time, for people like that to be told, it's all us or it's all exactly the same, you shouldn't even ask about those questions. On some level, maybe saying nothing is almost giving a greater license to allowing them to have sexual intercourse in the Torah definition of the term rather than trying to do something which is only rabbinic. Or, for example, to have them violate the precepts of nida, which is a chiyuv karet, which is a very, very serious prohibition, rather than, for example, having their girlfriend go to the mikveh, in which case it becomes a Torah or rabbinic prohibition, but no longer a chiyuv karet. I am certainly not suggesting someone do that. This is a serious, serious public policy debate and a big issue which has to be discussed. But I'm just sort of outlining right now my own hesitation and even talking about this just before we take it further.
Yeah, I'm seeing you, and I feel so bad for you. I mean, I
don't
hear
feel
you,
bad for me.
I hear you ruminating about the very serious responsibility as a Rav, as somebody who is very dedicated to teaching our sources and teaching our values. And I totally understand where your hesitancy to talk about this comes in, because talking about it, many people are afraid that it gives legitimacy to people picking and choosing behaviors which are appropriate to them, and they may actually use the measure of rabbinic versus Torah, Doraita, in order to decide. But let me try and relieve your anxiety about that. I think that it is very obvious from the sources, and you brought sources, that I like to talk about the flavor, the overall flavor, without looking at exact halachic prohibitions. The overall tone is that a sexual relationship should occur in the context of marriage. And there certainly are specific rules and regulations that teach us how to stay within that framework. Having said that, we need to be really aware of the realities of the world in which we live today, which is very, very different than the world that Rambam lived in. Therefore, we need to acknowledge that we need to be discussing sexual education, sexual activity, and sexual behavior before marriage. Because these things are in fact taking place, obviously they are taking place.
Well, people, I think many people at least, have this unconscious realization, or they wish they did, that if I don't talk about it, it's not happening.
Well, that's exactly what is happening on the ground in the experience of young people. To give you an example, somebody once talked to me about what it was like when she was in seminary. And she said, we would go out to a bar to hook up with the yeshiva guys. Now, she said to me, I was this perfect religious seminary girl who nobody would think of as being out of the box in any way, from home, dressed, really modestly. But for those few hours, we would go out, we would get drunk because hooking up involves alcohol, fool around with somebody, and then forget the whole thing happened. In other words, for those moments or hours or however long it took from beginning to end, I was not in my own body. I was split from that experience.
And what ramifications did that have for her own religious life afterwards?
Well, it had a lot of ramifications because she was a married woman and she...
Later on, you mean?
Later on, she experienced her sexuality in a very split way, in a conflicted way, and in a way that does not acknowledge her sexuality as part of her present experiencing. It's something that was relegated to a separate self, so to speak.
And probably in her marriage, it was looked at in her own way as something dirty that you have to do in marriage. Some
couples believe that because they were not successful in upholding the difficult expectation to not engage in any kind of physical intimacy, that's why they're now suffering. That's why they're now having difficulties. They believe that that's their punishment.
In what sense? What do you mean they believe? As a divine punishment, or do you mean psychologically?
Well, I think that's psychologically, they believe that it's divine punishment. The guilt, the shame, the conflict contributes to those cognitive beliefs.
And as we've said before in other episodes, because sexuality itself is so powerful, it has this additional layer of guilt for whatever reason that exists psychologically or socially. It has this layer of guilt that does not apply to people who are Baalei Lashon Hara, for example, which if you look at the sources is a terrible thing to do, and yet people seem to move on with that quite well in general, it seems to me. Right. When it comes to sexuality, it stays with a person forever, and that can be a very dangerous thing.
Yeah, and we want to keep sexual development healthy, and the way to do that is to be able to have the opportunity to process and communicate and talk about what's going on and not just hide it away as if it's not happening. In the course of my professional life, I talk to many, many couples. And, I see couples all across the religious spectrum. Mm-hmm. And one of the questions that I ask almost across the board is about premarital intimacy, both emotionally and physically. Many couples obviously will say, believing that they're the only ones, that they were not successful in being Shomer Negiah, meaning that they did engage in touch. But often the way that they frame it is, if they're an Israeli couple, they might say, nafalnu. We had a nifilah. We felt it's always framed in very negative terms. More modern couples may not necessarily put it in those terms. They may actually take more responsibility for the behavior, admitting that they actually chose it because it was just too difficult otherwise, which in a way is a bit of a healthier approach because they are taking responsibility for choosing the behavior. And if you can take responsibility for choosing the behavior and you can talk about the behavior, you can also negotiate it. And the problem,
What do you mean by negotiate it?
Well, what we talked about in our masturbation episode and a little bit in our subsequent episodes have been about the development and formation of a sexual sense of self. And we've mostly talked about sexuality in terms of the self, as being part of the self. When we begin to discuss sexual behavior with other, we are now talking about interaction. Interaction with other requires communication, requires responsibility, requires discussion of boundaries. And so if we use either I'm, keeping the laws, I'm Shomer Negiah, or I'm not keeping the laws, I'm not Shomer Negiah, and that is the only arbiter of sexual behavior, then what we have is either there's, no touching, or it's hefker, anything goes.
Anything goes.
And so a young woman who is brought up to believe that there's nothing to discuss because you shouldn't be engaging in any touch, she may actually believe that once she starts to do something with her boyfriend or with somebody, even if she's engaged to him or even if she just hardly knows him, that's another whole issue there, then there are no other factors.
In other words, you've crossed the boundary and
you've
doesn't
crossed
make it,
the
it's
boundary.
over.
Okay?
Go ahead.
So now if we take a look at some statistics from the secular world about adolescence and sexual behavior, we have some very interesting facts that we can learn a lot from, especially in America. And I want to compare what goes on in the United States to some other places in the world.
Okay.
So in America, what some recent studies have looked at...
And this is not among Jews per se.
No, not amongst Jews. In the general sexual culture, one researcher, her name is Peggy Orenstein, she has interviewed girls from the age of 15 to 20. And what she found is that for many young women, they engage in sexual activity for various reasons which might surprise you. Why would you think that a young girl would choose to engage in sexual activity?
I mean, I would assume my first reaction is because of pleasure or because of pressure from her boyfriend. That would be the two things that pop into my
Well,
head.
they're very different things. So
they sure are, yes.
So, if they are engaging out of pleasure, out of curiosity, out of desire, we could look at that if we put aside the Jewish values, we could look at that as pretty healthy reasons to engage, especially if they're engaging with responsibility, with mutual respect, with consent, with discussion. But when we look at to please their boyfriends, now we're looking at what some of the very common factors really are. In fact, in another study that I read, the most common reasons why 14 and 15-year-old girls reported losing their virginity were, number one, to get it over with, number two, to keep their boyfriends, and number three, because everyone's doing it.
Those were the top three reasons.
Those were the
they
top
did it?
three reasons.
Pleasure didn't even come into it.
Pleasure did not even come into
Wow.
it. And so because, we live in a modern world, it is very likely that our girls growing up in our religious culture are going to be very influenced and also not necessarily even know about pleasure or understand about responsibility, and may also feel that they need to engage in these behaviors because either, they did it once. So since they already broke Shomer, then that means they're not Shomer. So now they have to do it over and over again. Or their boyfriend expects it. If we don't talk about the expectation for pleasure, sovereignty and autonomy, boundaries, just because you tried something once because you were curious doesn't mean that you have to do it every time.
And I know you have said, I read something that you once wrote where you said that, surprisingly, at least to me, the more education a person has, it seems based on studies, the more likely they are to set up boundaries as opposed to going and treating it like hefker, like there's no boundary.
We know this from, we had in the Bush administration the abstention years of sex education in the United States. And what they actually found is that abstinence-only education resulted in higher rates of sexually transmitted diseases and infections and higher rates of pregnancy. And, the kind of motto that came out of that is that in order to say no, you have to know. Mm-hmm. So education is really important. And education is really not just about fear of pregnancy or fear of disease and what you shouldn't do. Education is about communication. What do I do if? What do I do if I don't like something that my girlfriend is doing? How do I tell her? Or how do I tell him if I don't want to engage in this certain activity. How am I going to feel? How is he going to feel? What resources do I know about if I do get pregnant or if I do have transmitted disease? And do I know how I could get pregnant? The less we know, the more higher the pregnancy rates are going to be and rates of infection or other issues.
Yeah, but Talli, I want to ask you something, because at this point I'm thinking now as a parent or as a teacher, how do you navigate that line? I guess this is going to be a regular theme in our podcast, this question though. How do you navigate that line between saying, look, it's all forbidden, but I want you to have this education about what happens if you choose to do it anyway? I would think that a lot of our listeners who are parents or teachers would be thinking right now, very nice that education can prevent some of the more problematic things that can take place, such as sexually transmitted diseases or pregnancy, or even can set up boundaries. That's great.
It's not just that. It's also situations of, God forbid, rape or molestation or non-consensual sexual activity.
But at the same time, and obviously we don't want any of those things to happen, and at the same time we don't want to give the impression that we're okay with these behaviors. How does a parent or a teacher convey the idea that our values, our halachic values, say this is not behavior which I approve of, even though at the same time I want you to have this information should you choose bluntly not to listen to what I'm telling you about the halachic attitude?
Well, because like everything else, we need to be able to separate between our values, and every sex education module discusses values because we are a very diverse society. And so we need to be able to respect our own values and the values of the people that we interact with. And so we need to know going in, and since sexual education is usually directed at children and adolescents, one of the first questions that are asked are, what are your values and what are your beliefs? And children and adolescents should be able to articulate what they are. So their behavior should, as much as possible, be in accordance with those values. And sometimes those values can be changed as well, because part of development is also individuation and saying, I was taught this, but I actually believe this. And that's going to happen with children as well. What we would rather do is have a child come from a mindful place than from a place of feeling that they have no self-control, especially when it's dealing with another human being involved. That's very problematic, to have our children, whether they're sons or daughters, believe that they are unable to regulate themselves sexually.
Right. Well, that's where it takes it into a more serious realm than even we discussed in our first episode about masturbation, where at least in that situation, the only ramification is to the person's own feelings about himself, as opposed to possibly hurting another person as well.
Exactly. And so I think that when we teach kids, especially if we're teaching young women, that don't tease a boy because he then can't control himself, but yet she is curious or she wants to have some sort of intimacy with such boy. Let's say she really wants him to put his arm around her. That's all she really wants. But she is of the belief that now she has to pay a price. Now she has to go all the way, or at least engage in oral sex, which would keep her a virgin and make sure that they don't transgress the sex law. And this happens to be a reason, not just in the religious society, but even in the secular world, why young women report engaging in oral sex. And they say, look, it's no big deal. That was one of Peggy Orenstein's findings with these 15-year-old girls, that they said, it's not a big problem. I can do it. I can do it for him.
In other words, I'm still a virgin.
Yeah.
I haven't lost my virginity. It's not real sex. It's oral sex, which on some level, halacha acknowledges as well. As I said, it's called derech evarim. It's still a type of sex, but it's not considered sex that is actually a prohibition of the other sorts, that a person will be chayav karet or whatever it might be, should he do it with a certain person.
And interestingly, these young women also reported that they prefer to do it because it's less intimate. And it is a way of providing what the young man that they're with wants. And, I think that there are a lot of difficulties with that, because these are not fully developed human beings. These are 15-year-olds, and this is an opportunity to talk about, well, what about your pleasure? What about, why is it that every time it's just him getting pleasure?
So in that case, Talli, could you model how you would talk to somebody, like a student or somebody else, how you would speak to them about these things? How would you open the conversation to balance these two things we're trying to discuss today, the halacha and the importance of education?
Well, I think that it's really important that people whose role it is to help develop our children with morals, with values, don't give false information about sexuality.
What do you mean? What's false information?
Well, once I was about to give a talk at a high school. I don't do that so much anymore today. There are a lot of people who engage in giving lectures at high schools. And the principal said to me, make sure that you explain to them how dangerous it is to engage in these activities. Now, these girls were already in 12th grade. Many of these girls will be married when they're 19.
I said this is a religious high school you're talking about.
1 year later, they will be married. And so I said to her, wait a second, in a year from now when they're married, these activities are no longer dangerous. Now, if they're dangerous, why are they dangerous?
What does she mean when she says they're dangerous?
Well,
what
she
was
wanted
she
me to
referring
scare them. To talk about diseases and to talk about
pregnancy?
Yeah, to talk about those things. And I said, look, I think it's important that we talk about values and expectations, but I'm not going to tell them that engaging in these behaviors is dangerous now, but not dangerous once you're married. That makes no sense.
Right. Truth. This comes down to you have to be honest with them about that. So again, but how do you open that conversation with whoever you're speaking to then? What would you say?
I don't. I mean, I think...
Should you do it? I mean, what would one do?
Well... I think that it's very individual. It's very personalized. I think that, first of all, we need to let adolescents know that it's okay to talk about these things and that it's okay to ask these questions. And many of these questions may be psychological questions. Many of them may be related to sexual health and development. And many of these questions may be halachic. Is it better to do this or is it better to do that? Or if I am going to be engaging, should I be going to the mikveh? So there needs to be, I guess you would call it an interdisciplinary approach between rabbis, between mental health professionals, parents, so that people can refer to one another to answer the questions appropriately.
I'm glad you said that because I think it's very important that if nothing else comes out of this podcast, I'm hoping that rabbis who are listening will realize that it's up to them to make sure that people know that they're available to discuss these things in a non-judgmental manner. Meaning, a rabbi, obviously, he's not going to approve or tell you he approves of a certain type of activity if it's against halacha. At least, I hope a rabbi wouldn't approve of it. Approval and acceptance are not synonymous. A rabbi can accept what you say without saying this is halachically permissible and discuss it openly. And rabbis have to telegraph and say and explain that they are willing to discuss these things in a genuine way, because I think what you said really hits the nail on the head. It's not about telling everybody a public policy. It's about having these personalized discussions for any individual based on what his situation is. I think that there can't be a public policy. It depends on whom you're talking to in any given situation. At least that's how I think about it.
Yeah, and I also think it's really important to promote the idea that, I don't know if you want to call them boys and girls or young adults or people, individuals who are engaging together, boys and girls or girls and girls or boys and boys. That's where somebody already asked me if we're only going to be heterosexist here, so I don't want to be heterosexist. But okay, so let's say we're talking about boys and girls. We talk to one another about what we're doing. We talk about it, we negotiate it, we negotiate what the boundaries are going to be. We talk about what feels good, what doesn't feel good. We don't turn these experiences into ones in which someone feels taken advantage of, or somebody feels that they're alone while the other person is experiencing something very powerful and they don't feel anything. Those are difficult feelings to have. And so what's important is that if you're going to do it, you've got to be able to talk about it. You have to take responsibility and discuss it together and not pretend. So many couples, they really don't talk about it and they pretend as though it didn't happen. Many couples, this is a really...
And they don't talk to each other about it also?
They don't talk to each other. I'm talking about couples...
You're not talking to a therapist. I mean talking to each other.
I'm talking about couples who have come to me, let's say, for therapy, and will report that when they were engaged and they had these, what they would call nifilot, or they had these failures of being successful at basically keeping their hands off of each other, they would make out or do whatever they would do, not talk about it, sometimes feel extremely guilty. Sometimes the woman would feel guilty because he will say something like, don't come over tonight, giving her the impression that she's a michshol, she's an obstacle for him, and so she's
causing him to do the bad thing that he's doing.
Sin.
Right.
So this and these dynamics stay in the marriage,
and that can have serious consequences. I'm
sure
sure.
Definitely has serious consequences. For one thing, many couples report that what was really exciting and fun for them beforehand, even though they felt very guilt-ridden with it, is not as exciting and fun once it's permitted. And that's a common dynamic that gets discussed, but that's not for now.
That's not for now, right?
We can talk about that later in a subsequent podcast.
Maim genuvim yimtaku.
Yes.
The stolen waters are sweetest. Yes, that's a different context there. Just before we wrap up, I want to make another point. Going back to some of my original hesitation, which I'll mention again, at the same time, I do acknowledge that halacha is not monolithic. And obviously, as you're saying, we have to realize that, for example, I teach chatan classes, and there are almost 3 basic categories to oversimplify. There's sexual intercourse in the context of nida, when a woman is ritually impure. There is touching, specifically chibuk v'nishuk, talking about foreplay or sexual touching of sorts. And then there are all the halachot, which means the various things that distance a person from his wife during that time, distance a wife from her husband, various things they shouldn't do so that they shouldn't be tempted to have intercourse during this approximately 12-day period when it's forbidden. And while there are certain things which are non-negotiable, it doesn't matter whether or not it's uncomfortable because you're in a family picture. You still can't touch each other. It's the way it goes. On the other hand, if you're sitting at the Shabbos table and they're passing around the challah, and you normally don't pass, but in this context, it will make her uncomfortable because everyone will realize she's in nida. There are certain very, very obvious leniencies that just pass the challah plate, and it's not a big deal. There are different levels, and at the same time, we have to be careful not to negotiate it ourselves. In other words, sometimes these levels might appear to be obvious, such as a chiyuv karet is more serious than a lav or a durabanan. And therefore, a person might on his own, without consulting a rabbi, say, oh, so I should try to lessen the prohibition. And that's what we talked about. She should go to a mikveh, so that way at least it's no longer a doraita karet, it's rather a doraita or a durabanan non-karet. It's not so clear, though. You need to seek rabbinic counsel. I'll give an example from a similar context, but not identical, where if you look at the simple halachic sources, it is more serious to have sexual intercourse when a woman's in nida than for a Jew and a non-Jew to marry each other, because that non-Jew is technically not a nida, so therefore it is a lav, it is a lo ta'aseh, but it's not chayav karet. However, a wife and a husband who have sexual intercourse while she's in nida, that is actually a chayav karet, much more serious.
We'll have to talk about that on our nida episode.
That's right. Episodes, I'm afraid. There might be a lot to talk about there.
Absolutely.
But given that reality, one on his own might say, well, since we're not going to keep Taharat HaMishpacha, better that we marry non-Jews. And Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky acknowledges that looking at the sources, that's what you would think, but it is absolutely wrong. That's not true, even though in terms of this level of Isur, level of prohibition, it sounds right, it's false. Better that a couple should marry who are not going to be careful about Taharat HaMishpacha, the laws of Nida, rather than marry a non-Jew, even though technically it's a lower level Isur. So my point is that this communication between a man, a woman, and between the rabbi is crucial, because they can't decide these things on their own. They have to be willing to talk to him, and he also has to be open to the reality that they're dealing with, rather than simply saying, if you have to ask, I'm not interested in discussing it because it's forbidden. There has to be communication and willingness to engage in dialogue on all sides of the equation, because these are very, very complicated subjects.
I hear what you're saying, Scott. I would like to just add to that the decision to consult with a rabbi is going to be a personal one and a one that a couple makes together. And what I think needs to happen is that the rabbis, or, clergy people who are involved in the Orthodox world, they need to be more open to being able to discuss things on far more of a 50 shades of gray level than black and white, and to be able to look at the realities on the ground.
Yes. And I think that deep down, behind the scenes, there are many rabbis who are doing this, and they're behind closed doors. When they're having a private conversation with a congregant or with a student, these conversations are much more open than a lot of people think they would be. I know this from experience. But I also know that in public, very often, the message they're sending is not nearly that they're so open as they actually would be in private. And it's important, I think, as you're just saying right now, we can conclude with this, that any sort of caregiver or any sort of clergy person or any person in a position of quote-unquote authority, whatever it might be, should make sure people know, you can come to me and talk to me, and I'm not going to be judgmental. I will tell you the truth as I see it. I will tell you the halachic reality as I see it, or the psychological reality as I see it. But I'm not going to start judging you, and I'm not going to call you a bad person and kick you out of my office.
And I'm not going to shame you. I know we're ending, but I do think that it is important to put in there that much of the shame that women and men, but more women, get is about, it's slut shaming. It's the feeling that if I did something, my value has decreased. And there are probably sources that have contributed to that belief. The belief that if I'm touched, even if I'm raped, I have become a prostitute. I'm considered like a prostitute. And I think that we really need to change that outlook to conform with modern society.
Well, a lot of what you said in these episodes, with which I wholeheartedly agree, is a lot of it is framing. It's a matter of how we consider. There are certain sources that we look at and looked at from one perspective might say one thing and looked at from a different but equally valid perspective. I'm not saying changing the sources. I'm not saying to misread them, but looking at them from a different perspective and sometimes even a more accurate perspective might give a very different way of looking at it. Once again, to use the example that you and I were talking about before we went on the air, the idea of that Gemara in Masechet Brachot that talks about looking at a woman's little finger, which I suggested, that shows the importance of tzniut, and it does, but it also shows from your perspective, and I think even more accurately looking at the text, that objectifying women is fundamentally incorrect and against halacha, even if it's not looking at a part of her which would be erva, which would be a sexual part of her, would be something as simple as her little finger. You cannot objectify women. Reframing that Gemara, which could be understood as being a directive to women rather as a directive to men, which is the simple shot of the Gemara, also is a very important process. And I think we have to continue doing that. And with that, Talli, thank you. This was a terrific episode. I really learned a lot.
Great. Thank you. So did I.
You've been listening to Intimate Judaism on JewishCoffeehouse.com. Please look us up at intimatejudaism.com.
Send us your questions.
Send us your questions at intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn.
I'm Talli Rosenbaum.
We'll see you next time on Intimate Judaism. This is JewishCoffeehouse.com.